Hey there. I'm excited to announce this to you today. This is what you've been waiting for in your spiritual quest. This is something I've wanted to do for a long time, and I'm finally ready to announce it that it's ready to go. It's the Grief to Growth Community Circle. Now, this is a sanctuary where like-minded souls are united in their journey through grief and towards personal transformation. It's more than just a place. It's a beginning. It's a commitment to growth and understanding. Here you're finding not just a community, but you're entering a circle of trust and depth. You're going to engage with interactive coursework. You'll dive into exclusive podcast episodes and partake in discussions that illuminate the path from mourning to empowerment. This is a realm where every question is honored and every individual's journey is validated. To be part of this exclusive circle, visit us at grieftogrowth.com/community or look for the chat icon at the bottom of every page on the main website. Remember that entry is a privilege because I want to ensure that every member is as dedicated and genuine as you are. You must apply to join, but the journey within is worth every step. So go ahead and join us today. Check it out, grieftogrowth.com/community, and I look forward to seeing you there.
Hi there. Welcome to Grief to Growth podcast. Your host is Brian Smith, spiritual seeker, best-selling author, grief survivor, and life coach. Brian believes that the worst tragedies of life provide the greatest opportunity for growth. Brian says he was planted, not buried, and he is here to help you grow where you've been planted by the difficulties in life. In each episode, Brian and his guests will share what has helped them to survive and thrive. It is his sincere hope this episode helps you today.
Hey, everybody. This is Brian Smith back with another episode of Grief to Growth. And today I've got with me Beth Cavenaugh. As always, I'm going to read Beth's bio. I'm going to introduce her, and then we're going to have a conversation. Beth is a certified hospice and palliative care nurse. She's a Reiki practitioner. She's a writer, and she's an educator. She's going in her 25th year as a nurse, and she spent the last 15 years caring for hospice patients. Beth writes about end-of-life matters and published a book, Some Light at the End, Your Bedside Guide to Peaceful Palliative and Hospice Care. So with that, I want to introduce Beth Cavenaugh.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I'm really looking forward to talking to you. I'm always fascinated by people that go into the field of palliative care. And I know, what type of nurse were you before you went into this field? And then what made you decide to go into palliative care?
I think I was just kind of a regular nurse. You know, when you start out, you kind of go wherever you can get a job. I worked in internal medicine for a while. I worked at an AIDS hospice for a while. I worked at in a nursing home for 3 weeks. I worked in short stay surgery. And after, I was raising kids at the time. So after about a decade of nursing, I took a break. I wanted to just kind of pause because I thought, short stay surgery was, the people were amazing. The schedule was amazing, but I wasn't feeling fulfilled as a nurse. And I think I just had a little more space in my life to kind of look for something that was maybe a little more fulfilling to me. And so I took about 9 months off and I just hung out with my kids and my family and really kind of explored what would feel meaningful to me. When I worked at the AIDS hospice, I just was there for about 1.5 years, but that had a profound impact on me, just being able to show up and be present for people at the end of life. And my mom died in 1998. So in those first 2 years of being a nurse, my mom had died and I was able to be with her and experience hospice care. And I took care of her at the end of her life. And so I found this really sweet hospice home here in Portland and started to work there. And that's when I felt like I had kind of landed professionally.
Interesting. So, and that's when you decided you were just going to go into palliative care like full time?
Well, I guess so. I mean, I think I never really make a decision to, this is going to be my life's work, but I definitely felt like I was going to stay, and it felt really good every day that I showed up, and it felt very meaningful. I didn't realize with hospice care, you take care of the family as well as the patient. And I loved that. I loved, they were 50% of my patient and my time. and I loved educating them. And I loved to be able to, because it was in a hospice home, I was actually able to be present for the deaths of my patients. A lot of times hospice is in a patient's home. So you're not, as a nurse, you're not necessarily there when they die. So it felt like it's a really special place in general, and a spiritual place. And it felt very sacred and holy to me. And so I kind of kept at it.
Yeah. So what are some of the challenges of taking care of a hospice patient? You mentioned one thing that a lot of us don't realize is you spend a lot of your time with the family.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So what are some of the other challenges?
Well, I think that, let's see. A lot of times when people come onto hospice, they're not exactly ready to die. So there's a lot of emotional work that you have to kind of sit with the patients and help them process the end of their life, and maybe do some life review, or just checking in with them as they go through their anger or, relationship issues. So hospice care is the emotional, spiritual, and physical care of a patient. So it's very holistic. End of life brings up all of those issues. You have all these physical things going on, but you also have, how do I want to exit this earth? How do I want to leave the planet behind? How do I want to, tidy up my business with my family and my friends? It's challenging, but it's also, also the beauty in it. Like, as you say, every challenging moment has opportunities for beauty and growth. And so I love being in that space with people, but it is, I'm not a social worker. I'm not a trained, counselor, but as a nurse, you just show up for these moments. You happen to be there at the bedside when they're kind of going, what is happening to me? I'm 50. I just climbed Mount Hood, 6 months ago, and here I am dying. And you just have to kind of be present for them. And, I can't help them work through their stuff, but I can bear witness to their suffering that they're going through.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I've learned a little bit about hospice work. And as you said, you can't really offer certain types of help, I guess. So what's the line of how much help you can offer to someone that says, like, what's going on with me, or I'm scared?
Well, I think that the best advice I received from another nurse was, sometimes you don't have to have answers, and silence is okay. And that really freed me up enormously to just be with people and sit in that uncomfortable silence that most of us hate anyway, the 7-second pause, and allow them the space to be there, or just, give them, that sounds shitty. I'm so sorry. This sounds terrible. I can't imagine what you're going through, but not leaving the room and staying in the room. And, because a lot of people don't want to be in that really uncomfortable spot.
Now, did you find, or do you find people accepting other deaths generally, or are they fearful, or what's the range of emotions that you see?
Yeah. I see, there's a wide variety of emotions. There's fear, there's anger, there's desperation, there's depression, there's flatness. There is, I would say maybe 10%, this is according to Beth Cavenaugh statistics, are joyful about it, and that's generally somebody who is in their 90s, has lived a very full life and is very supported, and their symptoms are managed, and maybe they have kind of this vision of the afterlife and what's coming next. But I think most people get to this point of acceptance. And it's really, sometimes it feels like resignation, but I do think there's this acceptance and this relief that can happen for most patients. And I think when people get to that point, it's it's a relief for them. It may not be a relief for the family, because that's a entirely, different
Right.
perspective and issue that's going on, because a lot of times always families are going through their own personal emotions around their loved one dying.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think that I've definitely seen acceptance happen, and that is just part of the beauty of why I like to be there, because I do think hospice gives people an opportunity to really process, the end of their life and find some peace and acceptance. We also have social workers on our team. We have chaplains on our team.
Mm-hmm.
We have amazing aides on our team and volunteers. So there's this team of people that is all, we all have the same goal in mind, which is to support this patient as they're dying, to keep them comfortable and to allow them the opportunity to process the end of their life.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hey there, something I want to tell you about today. My podcast platform, Buzzsprout, has recently made it easier for me to allow you to support me financially. Go to www.grieftogrowth.com/subscribe. That's growth2growth.com/subscribe. And once you're there, you can sign up to support me financially. Now, you can do it for as little as $3 a month, or of course, as much as you'd like. If you do that, you'll get access to bonus episodes, and you'll see those in the regular feed. They'll have a lock on them. But when you become a subscriber, you'll actually get access to your own private feed, and you'll be able to listen to the regular podcast along with the bonus podcast for the subscribers. I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for sharing the podcast. And I want to thank those of you who support me financially. Have a great day, and on to the episode. Yeah, so you touched on something there. We were saying there's the patient and how they're viewing their passing, and then there's the family and how they're viewing it.
Mm-hmm.
So are there ways that you can help families become more accepting of the demise of their loved ones?
Yeah, I mean, in theory, yes, there are. I think everybody's very different in terms of their acceptance of death.
Sure.
Like my dad, when my mom was dying, I was acutely aware the whole time that her prognosis was not good with lung cancer. And so from the start of her diagnosis, I was kind of anticipating that she was going to die.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was, but I'm also I'm a nurse, so I'm kind of realistic to a fault.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad, his whole goal was to keep her alive, to keep her well, to heal her, to feed her, so he never, I really don't think he ever accepted that she was going to die ever, until afterwards. And even then it's difficult to accept. I think that, my thing with families is to be, have kind of a gentle but transparent offering, really to talk about, continue to talk about the importance of this time, and, to talk about what does this patient need at this time. I think you can talk about death and dying. A lot of people don't like the words death and dying, but you can say, what would your grandma want right now at this time? Is it important for her to have a religious ritual? Is it important for her? Should we call up her sister that she keeps talking about, and maybe she can talk to her on the phone? So I'm constantly trying to just plant the seed, like that. This is the time. This is the only time that we can really give the patient what they need at the end of their life, so they can die more peacefully, ideally. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times you have to be pretty subtle about it, because like I said, a lot of people don't like talking about death or dying, and they don't want to hear those words. And, a lot of people don't believe, that their loved one is actually going to die. Like I said, my dad, he was totally surprised. I was actually surprised when my mom died. I've been with my patients who've been on hospice for years or months, and when they die, I'm still surprised. There is this element of surprise, like, oh my gosh, that I can't believe they just died right now. And so yeah, I think that I think it's just continuing to offer some transparent but gentle information that they have opportunities for closure and to express their love to their loved one.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to ask you this. We have this idea that death should be easy and peaceful, and I know sometimes it is. But what about when it's not? When
Yeah.
it's not peaceful and it's not easy, the patient might be scared, they're resistant.
Mm-hmm.
What would you offer to a patient, and what would you offer to a family going through that?
Yeah. I've definitely been around plenty of not peaceful deaths. And so I guess that with that, I just want to say that it's common. I think for people who are grieving a loved one, there's this sense of maybe guilt or concern over how it went down. And they think maybe it could have been better. Maybe they could have done something different.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm here to say that sometimes deaths aren't peaceful, and sometimes they're not as beautiful as you want them to be. And sometimes patients might be in pain. I mean, we as a hospice team, we try as hard as we can to get symptoms managed. But death happens kind of as it happens,
Right.
and with all the medical intervention that there can possibly be. And a lot of times patients are in their home. So it's not like they have all the medical intervention that we can possibly give to them.
Right.
So sometimes it's just not as pretty or peaceful as we all want it to be. And when it's not, I mean, for patients, I think we're constantly, if they have physical symptoms, that is kind of a constant thing that is you need to titrate medications for pain management, and you need to titrate medications for shortness of breath. So you're kind of constantly trying to alleviate these physical symptoms that they're having.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times patients will have this existential suffering, which, is that I don't want to die. I don't ever want to die. I'm not willing. And then there's this just suffering element that is going on while people are dying. And a lot of times you can't medicate that away. I mean, you can try, and there's certainly tools that we have, but sometimes you can't. And I think if you, again, show up for them and just try to be present to it, and call on your hospice team for any medical guidance that they can give, that's the best support we can offer. And then for the family, I think just realizing that sometimes it's not peaceful and it's not beautiful, so that people don't kick themselves after they've died to think that maybe they could have done something differently, because sometimes you just can't.
Yeah.
I do think that if you contact the hospice and really, have them come over and help as much as they can, then at least we can try our best to medicate and, get them comfy.
Yeah. I actually have a friend that just went through this with her mother, and she had her mother in her home, and she was clinging to life for literally years. They thought that she was about to pass, but she just, kept hanging around. And, and my friend was like, I thought this was supposed to be peaceful. I thought death was supposed to be beautiful. And I think sometimes we have that expectation, and then there's the guilt that we weren't able to make it that way.
Right.
And also, another thing I've seen is people feeling like I need to keep this person in my home, and running themselves ragged, trying to keep them in their home. Yeah. What would you as a hospice professional say to someone going through that decision as to when do I let go of trying to do everything?
Well, as you know, we can't do everything. It's impossible, or we just, burn out. I think that, hospice is a beautiful system, but it's also an imperfect system. A lot of times patients, there aren't many other opportunities for them to stay anywhere else other than their home. A lot of this is like insurance driven and financially driven. And so, you have to do out-of-pocket cost if you go somewhere like a nursing home or facility. And, or you can have caregivers come into your home, which, is expensive. But my thing is always, oh my God, if you can afford it, bring caregivers into your home to help you out, because a lot of people, most people do not like changing diapers, adult diapers. It's a really hard thing to do. And with family and family dynamics and how that goes, that's not the kind of relationship most people have with their mother or their father.
Right.
So I think you can't do it all. I think if you have the financial means to get caregivers to come in periodically throughout the day or throughout the week, just to alleviate some of the burden, or call in the troops, call in other family members, call in friends to help out. So I think oftentimes hospice care is in the home. I think that if it's but if people have the opportunity to go into a hospice home, I mean, I work at a hospice home now, and I love working at an inpatient unit because I feel like as soon as they come through the doors, the family is just so relieved, because it's been so hard, like you're saying, to take care of their loved one at home. Because, P.S., their loved one is also the family who's taking care of the patient who's dying. That family member is totally going through their own grief. They're doing all this physical care and labor of their loved one, which is the most meaningful gift you can give to somebody, but it is also exhausting. So, it is just kind of a delicate dance. And I think that if somebody has the opportunity to go into a hospice home and the family is all agreeable and they've checked it out, I think it's a great option, because people who are in the hospice homes are trained in end of life care and pain and symptom management, and and there's the team of support people that can support the patient and the family while they're in there with their loved ones. So,
yeah. And, there obviously are financial considerations, but I've seen people, it's like a guilt thing. It's like, well, she's my mother. She took care of me when I was a baby. So now I need to take care of her, something like that. And then, but I would point out to okay, well, they have 3 shifts of nurses when they're in a full facility, and you're just one person. So even if you were a nurse, you couldn't do this.
Yeah, you can't. I mean, you just simply cannot take care of somebody 24/7 without losing your mind or hurting your back. I mean, like I said, there's a ton of labor involved. So I think that, when I was thinking about being on your podcast, and people who are grieving their loved one of my missions I was feeling very strongly about is to alleviate people of their guilt burden that they feel, because it is, you can be a much better daughter when you have somebody else who's showering your mom and bathing your mom. And you can just show up for your mom and not worry about the medication stuff or, changing her diaper or administering suppositories. So I just think it's hard to stay in the daughter lane when you also have to, shower your mom and change her linens. But I think if you have the opportunity, boy, I say do it right away. And, most people sign up very late for hospice. So I think that I'm terrible with statistics. I heard recently the average length of stay was about 20 days. But so most people sign up for hospice late, and most people don't realize that it's probably not going to be that long of a time. So the sooner you can get caregivers in, just try it, for that first week. And a lot of times the patient will decline over the next 3 weeks. And, you will have been able to be with your mom in a really supportive way, not physically exhausted. You'll be able to remember, you'll be able to think of all the things you want to tell her. And you can have, some other caregivers in there to do some of that physical labor.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I'm glad that we touched on that, because that's one of the big things I like to do also is alleviate people from this guilt that we seem to heap on ourselves. And we expect ourselves to be, Superman, and be able to do everything. And I like what you just said, this frees you up to do other things that are more beneficial and not, tear down your own health while you're, supposedly trying to help someone else in a situation that's impossible for you to really handle on your own.
Right. And I see a lot of 80-year-old, men taking care of their 80-year-old wives. And I just feel so sad for them because, like I said, it's a lot of labor and it's a lot of work. And usually 80-year-olds have their own health conditions going on and they're physically exhausted too. So I think that if you can have anybody else come in to help, do it and do it sooner than later.
Yeah. Now, one of the questions, and we kind of touched on this before, but I want to go back to it. I think we have this Hollywood image of how people are supposed to die or how people die. So from your perspective, what's kind of the range of what you've seen from people going through the process?
Well, I've seen it all. And I've seen people just kind of slip away. So I could go a lot of different ways with this, but in terms of like how death looks in general, death looks very different for everybody. And I think I've seen a lot of people, slip out of here really peacefully, subtly, gently, no symptoms, no physical symptoms, family around, that's a beautiful death. When the physical symptoms are being managed, they're emotionally accepting or ready to die, and their family is supporting them and around them. I've seen, one of the worst. Do you want me to talk about the worst one? I don't even know.
I think people need to know there's a range of normal. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, these are the, best case scenario and worst case scenario. And I've seen somebody just really suffer on the way out, and family was not on board. Patient was miserable and in pain and died from probably a terminal event. So when I got there, something had happened, maybe a pulmonary embolus or something like that, which causes respiratory distress for people. And he was agitated and trying to get out of the bed and back in the bed and out of bed and back in the bed. And I was giving him as much medication as I could, talking to the doctor the whole time, trying to get the family back in the room to realize that this patient was actually dying because it had happened so suddenly. And then the patient finally settled and the family all gathered around, and we all sobbed. I did too, because it was really awful. And, but I feel like, in the end, the family was there, gathered around and sobbing, and they were together. And this guy went with a fight, like the biggest fight I'd ever seen. And, it was awful to witness. After that, I thought, God, do I need to go to Calcutta and work in the streets of India so I can get used to this, terrible stuff. And then I thought, no, it can be so much better. I know it could be better. It's just, this is the anomaly. So sometimes patients die like that. Oftentimes patients slip away. There's this other kind of in between, gradual process where people kind of die, kind of slowly over time. And hopefully you manage their symptoms. You're kind of titrating their medication so that their pain is managed, and, they're as comfortable as possible. They end up, sleeping more, then they can't get out of bed. And they continue to sleep more, and they die. And usually you can tell, hospice nurses, we can usually tell when patients are, in theory, about 7 days away, and we can kind of just keep going. Okay. Yeah. They're getting closer. So it is different for everybody. I also want family members to know that even though, we hospice nurses are okay, they're close, this is going to happen, we're wrong all the time, because death is this divine mystical event that happens. And even though we think we're in control of a lot of things, we're not in control of a lot of things. And so I really believe that there's just this bigger thing happening. And sometimes patients die suddenly. Like I talked about that one gentleman, he had a terminal event. I'll be in with a patient, maybe I'll medicate him. Maybe he's doing the crossword puzzle this has happened before, and I've come back and he had an event and he's actively dying. So, and he died maybe an hour later. Sometimes patients are looking at me and the families leave the room to go to lunch, and they've been there holding vigil the whole time, waiting for the patient to die. Patient doesn't die. As soon as they leave to lunch, the patient starts to actively die. I mean, it feels very directed almost.
Yes.
So there's, people, everybody wants to be there at the moment of death, but sometimes it just, with all of our medical technology and me being a hospice nurse for 15 years, sometimes we cannot call it.
Right. Well, and I think sometimes it's because the patient calls it because they want the person out of the room. Because I literally was talking to someone last week that their son was going through the dying process, and they were watching, they were setting a vigil and everything, and they were waiting for that last breath, waiting to see the last breath. And as soon as they all left the room, he took his last breath. So apparently that's been your experience also.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and I've had patients who, it hasn't happened that many times, but I have had patients who I've said, you are actively dying right now, and I would really like to call your family. And they have shook their head. No, don't call my family. Or I have said, can I bring your family in the room? And they will shake their head and say no. Or another patient, we said, we've called your wife, she's coming. And he is, shaking his head. No, like, I don't want my family in the room. And I don't know if it's a protective thing. It's likely that maybe it's just last memories. Maybe it's how they want to go. They don't want people to be around them. Dying is it's an individual sport. It is, we don't know what it's going to be like for us. I think I want my entire family around, but maybe I don't want my entire family around. I won't know until that happens.
Yeah. And it's, as you said, I think it's different for everybody. For some people, I think it's a privacy thing. It's like, I want to do this alone. This has been, relayed to me anyway. And I'm glad that we went through that, because I want people to understand that there are different ranges of things that can happen. It's not your fault if it wasn't great. And the thing I look at dying is kind of like birth. It's a transition. And so the thing is, when we're born, some births are easy. Some births, like my daughter Shayna, it's more complicated, more difficult. But either way, we get there. So when people are when they're transitioning, they're making the transition. So there shouldn't be any regret. It shouldn't be. It doesn't help to have regrets about what you could or shouldn't have done. And at this point, the way I look at it, that person is okay. They've made it. They've made it through the process.
We'll get back to Grief to Growth in just a few seconds. Did you know that Brian is an author and a life coach? If you're grieving or know someone who is grieving, his book, Grief to Growth, is a best-selling, easy-to-read book that might help you or someone you know. People work with Brian as a life coach to break through barriers and live their best lives. You can find out more about Brian and what he offers at www.grieftogrowth.com, www.growth.com, or text growth, GROWTH, to 31996. If you'd like to support this podcast, visit www.patreon.com/grieftogrowth, www.patreon.com/GRIEF, to make a financial contribution. And now, back to Grief to Growth.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hi there. I'm really excited to tell you about my latest ebook. It's 4 lessons that you can learn from the near-death experience without going through all the trouble of dying to learn them. I've been studying NDEs for several years now. I am completely convinced that not only are they 100% real, but that there's some very universal wisdom that we can get from the near-death experience. And I've distilled that down in this book into 4 short lessons. And I've also given you all the reasons why I believe that NDEs are absolutely real. So go to www.grieftogrowth.com/NDE lessons to pick it up for free. www.growth.com/NDE lessons. I hope you enjoy it. Have you experienced like people that are going through, when they get close, talking about visitors coming to see them that are people that are deceased?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, these are all the things that keep me staying in hospice, because I really do appreciate and love this connection with the divine, which is what being in end of life care really feels very connected to the divine. At least for me, it does. And most hospice nurses and people who work in hospice, they that is a very satisfying and rich part of hospice. I've been in the room with Jesus, so I was with a patient, and she told me, that Jesus was here and he was giving her a final blessing. And the family was so happy to hear that story, those kinds of things really people hold on to. And the patient who was dying, she had so much peace about her. I have been sitting next to another patient who I was just sitting and chatting with her. And I said, I'm going to go check on another patient. Is there anything you need? And she said, oh no, my he's here. He's sitting in that chair with you. So he was, just right there the whole time. And he had died 10 years ago. And, so I've definitely had a lot of experiences with people, kind of you can tell they're kind of in conversation with, other beings in the room. And, it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't happen all the time for me, but I definitely have enough of those where it makes me feel like it's very real. And this connection with spirit is very real. And it kind of drives my, enthusiasm, I guess, for, connecting with more divine elements of this end of life stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to ask you, in your experience, because I've heard this, that typically it's more nurses believe in the afterlife experience and doctors tend to not. Has that been your experience working in hospice care?
I don't, it's so funny. Like, I don't even know. I don't know if I could, I don't know if I've ever polled my coworkers to find out what their beliefs are.
So you guys don't talk about it?
I think I do with some nurses. Yeah, we do definitely. But I haven't really talked to a bunch of physicians about it. So I should start doing that. I like that idea. See I don't know. I mean, I can't imagine, because I feel like physicians are in this really amazing space. I would think that we all believe in something bigger. That's a weird generalization to make, but it's, for me anyway, it's really hard to be in healthcare and not think that there is something bigger out there. And we have to find meaning in our work. And it's really hard to find meaning in suffering if you don't feel like, this is just kind of our spiritual stretching as humans. And, I feel like there's so much about healthcare that is very difficult to witness, but, I think you have to have some, Dr. Dominic Vachon, he wrote How Doctors Care, and he talks a lot about how it's important to have some type of philosophy of care or spirituality of care. If you're agnostic or, whatever, but some kind of philosophy of care so that you can find meaning in the work that you do, not even just hospice, but, being a clinician of any kind in healthcare. So I think that, I think to really have meaning in this work, you kind of have to dwell and ruminate on what kind of gifts your patients are giving you, and what is next, and what is this all for? I mean, you can't help but not think about that.
Well, one would think, but it's not true for everybody.
Right. Yes.
And the reason that, and it might be different in your experience, even because you're in palliative care. So that's a very a deliberate thing to go into. And maybe the doctors who go into that maybe feel a little bit differently. But like, I think about Dr. Eben Alexander, who was a neurologist for, so many years, and, brain surgeon, and just was a total materialist until he had his near-death experience, and then wrote a couple of books about it. But he didn't look at the other side. I mean, because doctors are trained to death is the enemy. We're always fighting death. It's all about keeping people here. So I was going to ask you this, and you already kind of answered it. Because I know people would probably say to you, well, isn't it depressing being around dying people all the time? But your view of it's different, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I feel like it's so rich and real. And I'm the type of person who like, I've never been good at like just chit chatting and, just talking about the weather, pop culture. I don't even know anything that's going on with pop culture, but I really like to go deep with people and see how they're really doing and what's going on and how's grandma and yada, yada, yada. So, what was your question? Wow.
I was asking you about people would ask, a lot of times I would think they would ask you, is it depressing being around dying people all the time? It's like, you're around death. Isn't that icky?
Well, it's interesting because after the first year of being in hospice, I definitely felt depressed. And I was reading in a palliative care textbook randomly that there are these stages that people in hospice care go through. And after about 9 months, people experience depression. And I was kind of mad because nobody had told me that this was going to be, a possibility. And what it did for me was really go, oh, I had to then after the 9 to 12 months of depression, then you get to this place over the next year of, I can't remember what it's called, but it's kind of being okay with, this end of life event. And sorry, I'm not very articulate about it, but so I do think it can be very depressing, but I also think you have to kind of do a lot of work to get to this place of being okay with watching people suffering, bearing witness to their suffering, and not trying to fix a lot of their suffering. Like as hospice nurses, we can try to fix their physical symptoms, but there's a lot of suffering people just have to do on their own and on their own time frame. So I don't find hospice depressing. I find it very rich, and I find it full of life. I mean, our whole goal is to maximize the quality of their life, not the quantity of their life. So I love being able to, bring someone a sundae when, they've been diabetic their whole life and that's what they want to eat. I love bringing quality of life, like even if it's, having their grandmother or their grandbaby come in and visit them. I just feel like to have this moment in time where you actually do know that you're going to die and to be intentional about it is kind of amazing, really.
Yeah.
So
it can be very freeing.
I love it.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I don't find it depressing. And most hospice nurses, I would say, they're very fun to work with.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, I think when people say something like don't you find it depressing? That tells me something about their view of death. As I said, I view death as a transition. I view it. I've interviewed people, and there's just this term now. It's relatively new, I guess. It's called death doula. So you have a birth doula that brings babies in, and there's women that call them, or usually women, but people that call themselves death doulas because they're looking at it as a birthing into the next world. So they're sitting with the patient and they're working, helping them with their spiritual needs and helping the family and other things, practical things, getting their wills together and stuff like that. But that's why it's not depressing, because there's meaning in the work, and you're helping someone. If you believe there's something else, you're not watching people die. You're watching people move on to the next thing.
Yeah. And, I do feel like even for people who don't feel like there's an afterlife of some kind, it is still very gratifying to be able to comfort and support people, and give them what they need at their final moments, however they view that.
Right.
So even without, I think, like a spiritual worldview of what's beyond this, I think people can find it very satisfying to do this kind of work. And, I think I was thinking about the depressing piece, and I think that most people who ask that too, I think it's because, when they've lost a loved one, it's hard. I mean, going through that grief, as you know, is really a challenging, talk about spiritual stretch. I mean, it is tough. And I've taken care of family members and friends, and then hospice patients who I don't know. And it is very different when I am taking care of a family or a friend, because I feel I guess, I don't know if responsibility, but there's just kind of this added burden and kind of definitely emotional connection. I mean, it is, I still get really sad. Like that will never go away from me. And I hope it never does,
Right.
So it is very different when you're taking care of your own family members.
Yeah, it is. And you touched on something there that I think is really important, because I assume not that everybody believes in the afterlife. To me, it's self-evident. So I don't understand people that don't. But even if you don't, we know that when you're born, you're going to die. There's 100% chance that you're going to die. So there's something about our society that just doesn't want to accept that. We want to shut it away. We want to pretend it doesn't happen. So whenever it happens, people are surprised. It always amazes me. I'll see some celebrity that just, died at 99, and people are like, "Oh, it's so sad." And I'm like, how is it sad when someone that's 99 years old died? I'm sorry. I don't mean to be callous, but that's not sad for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
It's planned. It's biologically planned. If you don't believe anything else, that we can't live forever. So the work that you do is extremely important. I want to ask you about your book, Some Light at the End, Your Bedside Guide to Peaceful Palliative and Hospice Care. So first of all, who's it for?
I actually wrote it to a terminally ill patient. So if a patient was diagnosed with a terminal illness and the physician may have said, okay, now it's the time for hospice, I basically wrote the book from this is the start of their diagnosis to the end of their life. And I write it specifically to the patient. And I'm not sure if that was a great marketing move, but I didn't know anything about book writing and book marketing or anything, when I started this process years ago. But I write about hospice, what it is, what it isn't. I write about options that you have, choosing not to have hospice, or if you do choose hospice, how you can choose a hospice. I talk about just what the end of life looks like when patients' energy and mobility decline, when their appetite declines. I talk about managing symptoms, shortness of breath, constipation, pain, anxiety, delirium, all those things. And I talk about the end stage of somebody dying, and I talk about care of the dying. So I wrote it for a patient with terminal illness, but I definitely, I was thinking about the caregiver every step of the way, because, so all of our work is patient and family centered. Mm-hmm. So all of this, I'm constantly thinking about family members who are taking care of a loved one, because that is generally how hospice care looks.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of times the transition is more difficult on the family than it is on the patient. So I think it's really good to have that support there for the family. At least that's been my experience in a lot of cases. And kind of what to expect, because
right.
Again, we don't know, and we can face things so much better if we have an idea, of what to expect. So it sounds like a great book for not only the person that's gotten a diagnosis, but maybe for the person that's going to be the caregiver going alongside them.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely my intent, because I've done home hospice before, and I've done inpatient hospice, and I've done triage. So I've kind of seen all sides of hospice nursing. And I feel like patients and families struggle with this process because they don't know what it's going to look like. And, it's like anything. I mean, I had an appliance guy come over the other day, and he was helping me with the dishwasher, and he was explaining everything about my dishwasher. And I just thought, oh, this is so nice to have somebody who knows about this stuff.
Yeah.
I don't want to learn about it, but I'm glad you know about it. So yeah. It's just kind of like that. You just want somebody who can kind of guide you and support you along this process. And I really, I saw so many patients and families struggle, and they always have the same questions for us, the hospice nurses,
Yeah.
And, tell me about this medication. Tell me why they're constipated. Why are we increasing the pain medication? And so I really wanted to have just a really digestible, easy, gentle, but transparent book about this process, so people can refer to it when they're ready for the information. Because as I'm yammering on and on and on, people's eyes just glaze over and they're done after a certain amount of time. And then, I mean, people don't remember that much when they're in this state of grief or crisis or anything. So I just wanted to have them to have something physical and tangible they could hold on to when they needed it.
So what would you say are like the top 2 or 3 things that people need to know or might surprise people?
Well, I think that a lot of patients and families are kind of surprised with just the decline that happens. And I think it could be so much easier on everybody if we just knew that this was generally how it goes, where people aren't going to be have as much energy as they used to have. And over time, it's going to decline. And then they won't be able to actually walk around unless they have a walker. And then it's a wheelchair. And then they're bedbound. So through all of these stages, they're going to need help. They're going to need somebody with them. They're going to need help off the toilet. Then they're going to need help getting their briefs changed in bed. So I just think if we could kind of anticipate that this is generally how it looks, it just minimizes all that surprise. I mean, when I was taking care of my mom, I was surprised at every turn, and I'm a nurse, I'm a hospice nurse, but all of that information kind of went out the window when I was taking care of my mom.
Yeah.
And so I think and then there's also the food thing. A lot of patients and families feel like we're starving patients when we don't feed them. It's very important to feed patients. I'm a big fan of food. I'm a big fan of any kind of food they want, their favorite things. But at a certain time, it becomes, they lose their appetite. They don't need as many calories as you or I do.
Yeah.
They can't, it's harder to swallow. So that you have to transition them to softer foods that are easy to swallow. I mean, it's just kind of this ongoing thing. Then you need like ice cream or yogurt or applesauce, things that are really easy to swallow. And then they won't be able to swallow anything. A lot of families really suffer because of this. Families, our whole thing is to like feed our people, right? So it's a really hard thing to get on board with. I always say my dad, he was feeding mom steak and eggs until the day before she died, and she just was like, please make him stop.
Well, that's such a good point, because in my family, my culture, it's like, it's all about food, feeding people and stuff. And then my friend I was talking about earlier, going through this with her mother was like down to 90 pounds or less, was totally bedridden. And so she was drinking like maybe an Ensure a day or something. And they're like, well, isn't she starving? I'm like, how many calories do you think she's burning? At that point, just the input output, they're not burning any calories. And there's also seems to be a natural thing, I think, with humans and with some animals. When we get near the end, they just stop eating.
No, that's exactly right. Yeah. That's exactly right. And I think that, a lot of families, when they use the word starving, I kind of go on high alert, because I don't want families to feel that burden that they're not giving their loved one what they need, because there is this natural decline that's happening in our body, this physical process where we don't need to consume calories. The body is actually going through this process of dying, and so like force feeding, force fluids, all of that stuff, it's actually, it's more harmful than beneficial at a certain point. So, I mean, we don't recommend IV fluids because it's too hard on the kidneys, and, it could go to places like the lungs or the feet and cause discomfort. Or shortness of breath. So there really, like you said, I mean, there really is this process of, it's not starvation. It's just that they don't have an appetite and the body's actually declining and dying. This is the work of dying, and they don't need food at this time.
Well, I'm glad we discussed this, because, we're so used to, again, feeding and water, because it's just the same life. And we're not accepting the fact that life is ebbing here. It's going away. And these things can actually be harmful, even though it seems cruel to say at some point. I guess it's like you were saying, and people don't know this, at some point we even stop giving fluids. It's like, we're just going to let them go.
And I think you can always do things like we always offer food. So we'll bring in some yogurt and offer whatever they want. They might want a bite, they might want more than that, but always offer, when it gets to this point where they're really not wanting to eat much more than bites, just offering foods that they like, ice cream, little tiny bites of things. You can always moisten their mouth so that they don't, that minimize that feeling of thirst, moisten their mouth with swabs and stuff. So there's things that you can do to prevent any kind of discomfort, but and offering them things I think is really important. But there's just a point where, most people, they don't eat or drink anything before they're dying.
Yeah. Well, that's, I think, a really important point. And it's one that I didn't know till pretty recently. So I'm glad that we were able to cover that for people. What are some other things that people need to know?
I think that it's important to,
So what is another thing that people might need to know or might surprise people?
Well, I think that, I talked about people being surprised when the death happens. And because so much of hospice is in people's homes, I think people don't really give consideration to what's happening at the moment of death and after the death. And I want people to know that when somebody dies in their home, they can take as long as they need before they feel like they need to do the business, call up hospice team. If they want support, they can call up the hospice team any moment and say, can somebody come over and support me? My dad just died. But to think about those hours after the death and maybe a ritual or something that you might want to do, at our hospice house, we bathe the patient after they've died. You take off all their equipment, their oxygen and stuff. We have a quilt that we put over them. In our other facility, we'd put flour there, and then we'd offer a toast. We'd bring in sparkling apple cider and, sweet champagne glasses, and everybody would have a toast or something like that. So, one of my things with dying anyway is I think it would be important for people to just consider, what to do after their loved one has died, for a little bit of closure, but that kind of stuff also helps with your grief down the road. You can kind of hold on to these memories. But I think my biggest thing I want people who are on your podcast to know is that, if you cannot feel guilty about anything that happens really while somebody's in your home and you're taking care of your loved one when they're dying, I mean, that is my prayer for you, because things just are not clean and tidy with death. It is an awkward process. It can be messy. It's hard. It's challenging, but it's also beautiful and profound and rich. So just, if you're working through any kind of the guilt about like how your loved one was cared for or what happened or why you weren't there at this time, just know and trust that things happen as they should, and doing your best and showing up for them is the most loving gift you could have given to them. So,
yeah. Well, I really like what you said about that little ritual after the person passes. I have a friend whose son passed away. He had a terminal illness. He was in hospice, but he was at home. And after he passed, I think they washed his body and she took pictures with him and stuff, and I wouldn't have thought of that. I thought it was so cool that she did that. And that's a memory that they'll always have, that moment was a beautiful moment for them. As opposed to, like you said, rushing out and doing the business stuff. Take your time with it. And that's something that you can cherish for the rest of your time here.
Yeah. And really take as much time as you need. I've had, when I went to one patient's home, after he had died, and, his sons were there and they were playing their dad's favorite music, and it was loud. And then we dressed their dad from head to toe in like his, Sunday best. And, they were drinking, whatever their dad's favorite drink. It was like whiskey or bourbon or something like that. And it was filled with like tears and laughter and, the music. And I just think I remember it, and I've been with hundreds of people when they've died. And I can't imagine how good that will feel to them as they walk through the rest of their lives, knowing like just having the peace of that beautiful ritual that they did for their dad, those last moments with him. Because oftentimes, especially if it's 3 a.m. and somebody dies, you call the hospice calls the funeral home comes out, and they take your loved one away to the funeral home. And it can be very jarring for people, so I love it if people can just kind of consider that, like the after death moments, how they want that to look, and ask the patient how they want it to look.
Yeah, that's also a great idea, to ask the patient, what would you like to have done at that point? That's one of the things about being able to anticipate, a transition or death, is you can actually plan for it. And so hopefully you'll have, fewer regrets than if you hadn't planned for it. So I like I said, your book sounds like it's very, very much needed for people that are going through this process that we don't know a lot about. And just to be able to have that handbook of, what to expect, what types of things we need to plan for, because I know it does surprise people, like you were saying, okay, I have people say, well, she's sleeping all the time now. That's kind of a normal phase, right? That people go through, where it's like near the end, they're just, my thing is, I think they're going between worlds. And I've heard this from people who are death doulas. It's like, they're going back and forth at this time. So they're sometimes here, sometimes they're not.
Yeah, they call it the veil. The veil is thin, which I love that analogy, just kind of crossing over back and forth.
Yeah. So I have a friend. She's a medium. She's also a death doula, and she sits by the bed, and she can actually see in the other world and this world at the same time. So she sees the other spirits coming and going, and them communing. Like, we're getting ready. And I wanted to ask you this: have you heard this? People talking about taking a trip. Have you heard people say things?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm getting ready to go. I got to get my bags packed.
Yeah, that happens often. Actually, the travel metaphors, it's a thing. And it's so interesting. I've heard about people waiting in lines for cruise ships. I thought that was a fun one. If you think you're going on a cruise ship, that's great. Waiting in lines, getting their tickets, needing their passport, having to catch the train, open the door, so a lot of there's a lot of movement that's happening, and there's definitely this journey element to the end of life, which I just think I find really fascinating too, because it's a thing.
Yeah.
I think it's Final Gifts is the book by Maggie Callanan, and she talks about travel metaphors and the language of the dying. And it's a really sweet book about just the needs of dying expressed through their communication that is subtle and not very clear to us. But if reading her book gives you some really good ideas of things to look for.
Yeah. Raymond Moody wrote a book about nonsense. And later, I think it was with Lisa Smart, and they were talking about what we call nonsense, the language of the dying. And I think it's a lot of times because we don't understand the metaphors that they're using. So, and I think now, back when my father-in-law was going through dementia, as he was getting to the later stages, he would say all this it seemed like crazy stuff. And he would talk about people that were always deceased. The people, it was funny because he'd known people for many, many years, but he didn't talk about them. He'd always talked about people that were deceased and having seen them and what they were doing, or he was going to go see them. And at the time, I wasn't aware enough to realize what was going on. I just thought it was nonsense. We just thought it was hallucinations. So I want to offer to people to look out for those types of things. And when they happen, maybe don't dismiss it as they're just hallucinating or it's just the drugs talking.
Oh, right. I mean, I think you can really show up in a very different way if you, if somebody appears to be confused, to kind of sit down and really, you can ask the patient, I'm not really understanding. Or is there something you want to tell me? Or, kind of asking open-ended questions. If they're able to communicate that way, they might be able to make it a little clearer for you. But also, I think if you have this awareness that there are metaphors that are used at the end of life, and to look for them, I think you can really show up in a much more interested and engaged way rather than the dismissive way that, like it's easy to do, like, oh God, Dad's confused again. I don't know why he's talking about Uncle Joe, oh, that's so, I just think it's so cool. Like, wow, what an amazing opportunity that Dad's connecting with Uncle Joe.
Yeah. And the thing is, for one thing, not be dismissive of the patient to support them and what they're going through, but also for yourself. It could make it such a much more rich experience for yourself if you open your eyes up to what's really going on there.
Definitely. Yeah. I love that.
Well, Beth, it's been fascinating getting to talk to you about your experience, to talk to you about your book. I really appreciate the work that you do. I think it's so needed, and I'm glad to get this out there to more people to understand what hospice is and how it's available for people. So any last thoughts you want to say before we wrap up this afternoon?
No, thank you for having me. And I am really appreciative of the work that you're doing because, after somebody dies, it's a long haul. So and as you know, grief doesn't just go away. You have to kind of integrate the loss throughout your life. So I love the work that you're doing. And, I love talking about this topic. So I really appreciate you having me on it because my family doesn't really love me talking about death and dying all the time. So thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Yeah. Well, it's funny as you say that, because I talk about this stuff all the time. And I was with someone the other day and I was telling him I was getting ready to I did a past life regression like Saturday. And I just said it like, I'm doing this. My wife looks at me and she goes, yeah, looks at him. She goes, we're into this really weird stuff now. And I'm like, yeah, I forgot that everybody believes in this, but this is the world that I live in.
That's so fun. Well, I mean, I've done a lot of those things and I did a soul retrieval once. So all those things I think are really helpful. I mean, I don't know. I find them more like therapeutic than anything. So I love them.
Yeah. Well, death is just another part of life. As I said at the very beginning, if you're born, there's 100% chance that you're going to die. So we might as well face that. And the people that we're with, when we get married, I was talking with someone the other day. She's in a long-term relationship, and her beloved had passed away. And she goes, we were supposed to go together. I said, do you know how often that happens? That's not the way it goes. We don't get to go together. When we get married, one of us is going to be without the other one, and unless anyway, we won't go there. But yeah, we all go through. We all go through grief. We all go through loss. One way or the other. So let's just get prepared for it.
Yeah, let's try to get on board with it and make it as smooth as possible and support each other, through the process, because we're all going to need it at some point.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Beth, have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much. You too, Brian. I appreciate you.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Grief to Growth. Brian hopes that you find this episode helpful and will come back for future episodes. Brian's best-selling book, Grief to Growth, Planted Not Buried, is a great resource for anyone who is coping with grief or knows someone who is. If you enjoy the podcast and would like to support it, there are 3 things you can do to help. The first is to share the podcast with someone that you think it will help. The second is to go to iTunes, rate, and review the episode. The third way you can support the podcast is by becoming a patron. Head over to www.patreon.com/grief2growth. That's patreon.com/grief, the number 2, growth, and sign up to make a small monthly donation. Patrons get access to exclusive bonus content and knowledge that you are helping to spread the message of grief to growth. For more about Brian and Grief to Growth, visit www.grief2growth.com.
Hi there. I hope you enjoyed this latest episode of the podcast, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. What questions came up for you? What did you like about it? What didn't you like about it? I invite you to visit us at grieftogrowth.circle.so. That's growth2growth.circle.so to continue the conversation with me and with other listeners. It's a space to sound off, to share reactions, and to go deeper into the topics from the show. I look forward to chatting more, and I hope to see you there.